Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the news you're never going to find in the news because the news no longer reports the news. They just follow the narrative. By Nathaniel Ryan. This is episode number 1, and today is Tuesday, December 1st, 2020. All right, so here's the point of what we do here. The point is to unsettle the social order, because nothing is so unsettling to a social order as the presence of a mass of scribes without suitable employment and an acknowledged status. So we can talk about guys like Woodward Bernstein and Gareth Jones and the Ukrainian famine, and that movie Spotlight, based on the true story about the folks at the Boston Globe who let everybody know about the church sex abuse scandal. So those are some examples. All right, so Mr. Jones is a great movie. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it before or not, but it's definitely worth the watch. But probably the best line out of that movie is, "I don't have an agenda unless you call the truth an agenda." All right, so let's talk about Citizen Street guerrilla journalism, because that's pretty much what we're going to do here. So a gentleman named Glenn Reynolds, he was the Beauchamp Brogan Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Tennessee College of Law. He wrote an article in the New Atlantis in winter of 2006 called "The Rise of the Guerrilla Media." And a quote out of that article is, "The first-person character is one of the strengths of the independent journalism that the internet and other technologies make possible. Over the coming decade, we'll see the growth of alternatives to traditional big media." And we're seeing a lot of that today, still in 2020. So Mr. Reynolds also wrote a book called An Army of Davids: How Markets and Technology Empower Ordinary People to Beat Big Media, Big Governments, and Other Goliaths. A quote from that book states, "After the Indian Ocean tsunami and after hurricanes like Katrina and Rita, we've seen newspapers and television stations incorporate citizen journalism into their coverage via blogs, chat boards, and other mechanisms. In a crisis, the value of having thousands of potential correspondents out there with computers, digital cameras, and other technology is obvious, but in fact, the value is there all the time. Noticing that may take them a bit longer, but I suspect that they will notice in the end. Those who don't may wind up being overtaken by those who do." So kind of getting into where we're leading, right? Because we're in 2020. And if 2020 isn't a crisis, then I don't know what is. All right, so just a little reminder. Welcome to day 260 of 15 days to slow the spread. We're getting closer, guys. We're getting closer. Anyway, let's talk about masks, okay? So masks are here, with Dr. Fauci throwing out the first pitch of the Nationals game. Wonder if anybody ever saw the outcome of that pitch. This might be something worth looking up. We see masks here and there, and we see masks pretty much everywhere, right? So here's the question we're asking today. The question is, masks, are they effective? Are they necessary? Are they harmful? Interesting. How do we go about finding that? Well, here at, that's our really long name, we promise only one thing: the truth. So how do we go about finding the truth? Well, first I want to put out another reminder. Please do not trust me. Do not trust anyone. Do your own research. And there's a famous quote by our good old friend, Mr. Jefferson. So we might want to get some truth out of facts, right? Kind of makes sense. Data, evidence, proof, statistics. All right, we might want to get some from studies, but what's a study? And what is the purpose of a study? So this is an example of a study, right? So they have all these really fancy long words, and we have, they're always done at universities, right? And they always contain an abstract and an introduction and data and evidence and conclusions and references and all that stuff. So this is obviously a study, and obviously the purpose of a study is to get facts, to get evidence, to use data, right? To make conclusions based on those facts, evidence, data, etc., right? So, but we can do this, right? These studies may be technical and hard to read and hard to understand, but guess what? We can read these types of graphs and charts and data and evidence as long as they put it into a form like this, which most of them want the public to understand, and go from there, right? So let's get into this. Thank you to our contributor today. His name is Dr. Jim Meehan. There's a lot to do with Dr. Meehan, but the main thing I wanted you to focus on with him is down at the bottom there. It says Dr. Meehan is a former editor of the medical journal Ocular Immunology and Inflammation. Dr. Meehan has peer-reviewed thousands of medical research studies. With this experience and expertise, Dr. Meehan has dedicated his career to protecting his patients and the public from the fraud, corruption, and pseudoscience so often used by agents and agencies whose motives and interests have resulted in American medicine and pharmaceutical drugs becoming the third leading cause of death in the United States. Did you know that? So here's some key points to Dr. Meehan's contribution. Decades of the highest level scientific evidence, meta-analyses of multiple randomized controlled trials overwhelmingly conclude that medical masks are ineffective at preventing the transmission of respiratory viruses, including SARS-CoV-2, which is the fancy word for COVID-19, right? Those arguing for masks are relying on low-level evidence, observational retrospective trials, and mechanistic theories, none of which are powered to counter the evidence, arguments, and risks of mask mandates. The majority of the population is at very low to almost no risk of severe or lethal disease from COVID-19. Children are at an extraordinarily low risk of dying from COVID-19 based on CDC published data. There's that big long 99.998% of children that contact COVID survive. Transmission of SARS-CoV-2 among children in schools and daycares is very rare. Masks worn properly are very well documented to cause harm to their wearers. Masks worn improperly, reused, or contaminated are dangerous. Any reasonable risk to benefit analysis of medical masks concludes that the risks overwhelmingly outweigh the benefits. Children are at imminent risk of harm from mask mandates. So that's the key points. You know, you can stop there if you want, but I'm going to keep going. So here's a little outline of how this is going to work for us once we get through it. So Dr. Meehan has given us a hierarchy, right? So he's saying meta-analyses are basically the top quality of data, right? So basically a meta-analysis or a meta-analysis is you take a bunch of trials, you take a bunch of studies, you've took a bunch of reports, you've combined them all together, and you've made a meta-analysis of all these different trials and studies and reports, right? To have a preponderance of evidence, right? So the things at the bottom are background information, expert opinion. Those aren't very important in Dr. Meehan's world. Individual case reports, not that important. Case series or studies, not that important. Cohort studies, not that important. But once you get up into the non-randomized control trials and the randomized control trials, you're getting up there in the higher levels of evidence. And then the best are critically appraised literature, evidence-based practice guidelines, systematic reviews, which is basically the same thing as a meta-analysis, right? Just not as big, right? So remember that when you're looking at different types of evidence. So we have high-level versus low-level evidence. So advocates for mask mandates simply don't have the highest level of scientific evidence to support their arguments. They can only cite low-level science, retrospective observational studies. So things at the bottom of that pyramid, right? Evidence hierarchies are often applied in evidence-based practices. Wikipedia is going to give you a definition of all this stuff. So I can run through all this. I have tons of, Dr. Meehan has lots of different citations here. So these can all be clicked if you need to click those different things in there, right? So here's the references. All those numbers in that previous slide apply to these references here, right? So here we go. Masks are ineffective. We are all confused by the mixed messages we have received on masks wearing in the community, businesses, and schools. The issue has become tribal, divisive, and for most confusing. However, Dr. Meehan says he's not confused. He says he is fully informed on the scientific research related to masks. After reading this, you will be too. Then you can make the best decisions for you and your family. As you will learn from the material that follows, the evidence for and against masks should not be confusing. The evidence is clear. Masks are ineffective, unnecessary, and harmful. What is happening in the world today, including the misinformation surrounding community mask wearing, is about political agendas, symbolism, and fear, not science, says Dr. Meehan. And as you'll see, Dr. Meehan isn't just saying these things. He's going to back every one of these things up with lots and lots of evidence. Okay, so here's some mixed messages from the experts. The COVID-19 pandemic is about viral transmission. Surgical and cloth masks have repeatedly been shown to offer no benefit in the mitigation of transmission and infection caused by viruses like influenza and SARS-CoV-2, which is the same thing as COVID-19, right? Which is exactly why they have never been recommended for use during the seasonal flu outbreak, epidemics, or previous pandemics. Have you ever worn a mask for the flu? Flu a couple years ago was really bad, statistically speaking. The failure of the scientific literature to support medical masks for influenza and all other viruses is also why Dr. Fauci, the U.S. Surgeon General, the CDC, the WHO, right, the Centers for Disease Control, the United States headquarters of disease, right, and the World Health Organization, the world's version of the CDC, right, and pretty much every infectious disease expert stated that wearing masks won't prevent transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Although the public health authorities flipped, flopped, and later changed their recommendations, the science did not change, nor did new science appear that supported the wearing of masks in public. In fact, the most recent systematic analysis once again confirms that masks are ineffective in preventing the transmission of viruses like COVID-19. And then there's a link to the article that backs up what is stated in that previous slide. So, if the scientific literature demonstrated that masks were effective, then why, early in the pandemic, did public health experts tell the public not to wear them? Well, Dr. Meehan says that he has heard multiple answers to this question, but none of them are reasonable. So here's a couple explanations that just don't make any sense to him. Early in the pandemic, Fauci, the CDC, the U.S. Surgeon General, CDC Director Redfield, yep, that's his name, all said that masks were ineffective and would not protect the wearer or other members of the public from SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, lied to the public and Congress about masks because they were trying to protect the supply of masks for healthcare workers. Early in the pandemic, Fauci and all the folks just listed above there actually told the truth about what years of scientific research overwhelmingly concluded. Medical masks don't work to prevent the transmission or infection of viral respiratory pathogens. All right. So if the scientific literature demonstrated that masks were effective, I already said that, sorry. About a month later, for reasons that appear to have more to do with being lobbied by unnamed interest groups, they all began backpedaling and claiming that what they said previously was actually a lie. But they lied because they were trying to protect the PPE supply for healthcare workers. Absolutely no new research appeared to counter the 40 years of meta-analyses and systemic reviews of many randomized controlled trials that concluded that masks don't work to prevent the transmission of upper respiratory viruses. Several low-level evidence, retrospective observational mechanistic studies, and ridiculous masked hamster cage studies appeared in the scientific literature. The opinions and theories these studies offered were interesting and worthy of consideration, but they failed to explain or counter the large body of prior high-level evidence. Remember, what he stated was low on that pyramid. What we're talking about now is what's high on that pyramid. So in this paper, Dr. Meehan will show that none of these observational studies or mechanistic theories countered the large body of high-level evidence built on years of meta-analyzed and systemically reviewed multiple randomized controlled trials. So here we go. Redfield, Fauci, Birx, and the U.S. Surgeon General, the CDC, and the WHO have been terribly inconsistent, confusing, and flip-flopping on masks throughout the pandemic. We were frequently confused by the mixed messages coming from public health agencies early in the pandemic. Dr. Fauci, the U.S. Surgeon General, and the WHO, when you see that blue there, that means, where you see the right there, is a link. All told the public in no uncertain terms not to wear masks. Then, over the course of the next several weeks and months, the CDC twice changed their recommendations, as did the WHO, and the two agencies' recommendations consistently contradicted each other. Here's what the CDC said on June 4th, 2020. They published guidance indicating that masks do not deter the spread after as little as 15 minutes of exposure to someone with symptoms. There you go. The WHO, while recommending the wearing of masks for health professionals, the World Health Organization, which is the WHO, acknowledged that there is no evidence that mask wearing prevents the spread of COVID-19, and the science simply does not requiring otherwise healthy people to wear face masks all day. Further, at the present, there is no direct evidence from studies on COVID-19 and in healthy people in the community on the effectiveness of universal masking of healthy people in the community to prevent infection with respiratory viruses, including COVID-19. There you go. The WHO also acknowledged some of the risks long-term mask use pose to healthcare workers and others. Self-contamination due to manipulation of the mask by contaminated hands. Potential self-contamination that could occur if medical masks are not changed when wet, soiled, or damaged. Possible development of facial skin lesions. Irritant, I don't even know what that word is. Or worsening acne. I'm guessing it has to do something with acne. When used frequently for long hours, masks may be uncomfortable to wear. What else? False sense of security leading to potentially less adherence to well-recognized preventative measures such as physical distancing and hand hygiene, risk of droplet transmission, and of splashes to the eyes if mask wearing is not combined with eye protection. A lot of people forget about that one. I remember Fauci talking about that. Disadvantages for or difficulty wearing them by specific vulnerable populations, such as those with mental health disorders, developmental disabilities, the deaf, the hard of hearing community, and children. Difficulty wearing them in hot and humid environments. I haven't had to experience that yet. Hope I never do. More than 40 years of science has consistently concluded that masks don't work. No new science emerged to counter this conclusion. So what is the basis for the change in the direction that emerged from our public health experts? So here's a clue. The following is the Twitter post from Deborah Cohen. She is a UK correspondent for the BBC Newsnight and the 2019 British Journalism Award winner. She did a little investigating of the WHO and the change that they made from not recommending to recommending. And she says it all has to do with politics and lobbying. So this is her, and that's her Twitter handle. She is medically qualified. She's a UK correspondent. We already said all these things, right? So here's what she said in her tweet thread, I'm assuming. We had been told by various sources, WHO committee reviewing the evidence had not backed masks, but they recommended them due to political lobbying. This point was put to WHO, the WHO, right, the World Health Organization, who did not deny. We said, some people think we should not wait for RCTs before putting policies in place. RCTs are random controlled trials, so high evidence studies, right? So I'm assuming she posted this at 4:25 a.m. on July 12, 2020, and she continues on saying the ineffectiveness of face masks in stemming the spread of viral respiratory diseases, including COVID-19, is widely known and acknowledged in the scientific and medical research, literature, and scientific communities. Therefore, it seems that the transmission in public health recommendations to promote widespread mask mandates was based on a combination of low-level observational studies, bottom of the pyramid, speculative mechanics studies, fear, and most of all, politics, not science. To clear up the conclusion, I will argue that the scientific, not I, Dr. Meehan, will argue that the scientific evidence not only does not support the community wearing of face masks, but the evidence will show that healthy people wearing face masks pose serious risks to the wearers. So here is some evidence against masks. And don't worry, folks, there's going to be evidence for masks too, believe it or not. So here we go. Big data analysis of 25 U.S. states and 23 countries concludes that neither lockdowns nor mask mandates lead to reduced COVID transmission rates or deaths. Now remember, this blue is clickable. Go straight to the big data analysis. A new National Bureau of Economic Research working paper by Andrew, all these wonderful people, focused on countries and U.S. states with more than 1,000 COVID deaths as of late July. This analysis is the largest and most comprehensive analysis of the largest data set to date. In all, the study included 25 states and 23 countries. So the paper's conclusions is that the data trends indicate that non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as lockdowns, closures, travel restrictions, stay-at-home orders, event bans, quarantines, curfews, and mask mandates, do not seem to affect virus transmission rates overall. Systemic reviews and meta-analysis of multiple randomized controlled trials concludes that face masks fail to prevent transmission of viral respiratory pathogens. Continued, one of the largest high level of evidence studies on the effectiveness of face masks on the transmission of respiratory viruses, which was recently released by the CDC, is this guy, and the title is Non-Pharmaceutical. Measures for pandemic influenza is non-healthcare settings, personal protective and environmental measures, emergent infectious diseases, blah, 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 all that fancy stuff, and the CDC link. The CDC meta-analysis found that face masks fail to provide a significant reduction to virus transmission. In our systematic review, we identified 10 randomly controlled trials that reported estimates of the effectiveness of face masks in reducing laboratory-confirmed influenza virus infections in the community from literature published basically from 1946 through July 2018. In pooled analysis, we found no significant reduction in influenza transmission from the use of face masks. There is limited evidence for their effectiveness in preventing influenza virus transmission, either when worn by the infected person for source control or when worn by the uninfected persons to reduce exposure. So that's pointing to the wearer and others, right? Because I don't know about you, but I've heard, you don't wear masks for you, you wear masks for others. So there you go. All right, continuing on, our systematic review found no significant evidence of face mask transmission of laboratory-confirmed influenza. Mandates for children to wear face masks fails even a rational basis test and is clearly not in a child's best interest when assessed through a factual evidence-based analysis rather than a fear-based lens. Keep hearing this about fear and rationality, right? It is simply not rational to believe that face masks will be properly and studiously worn by young children for up to 10 hours in a school day, or maybe even 7, right? Or less. In fact, the overwhelming weight of scientific literature to date establishes that face masks do not prevent the spread of COVID-19 by, to, or from children. And there you go with a study down there at the bottom. So had thousands of randomized participants and resulted in no significant difference in the incidence of laboratory confirmed influenza. Here's another study. So you have a total of 6 randomized controlled trials involving over 9,000 participants. There was no statistically significant differences in preventing laboratory confirmed influenza. On and on. Meta-analysis indicated a protective effect of N95 respirators, but we can't get those, right? In the N95 respirators isn't an N95. Maybe I'll do another one of these on that. If you have more questions, just ask about that. All right, so meta-analysis indicated a protective effect of N95 respirators against laboratory-confirmed bacterial colonization. The use of N95 respirators compared with surgical masks is not associated with lower risks of laboratory-confirmed influenza. So they work, but they don't work, right? Here's another systematic review. It found that face masks provided a non-significant protective effect against 2009 pandemic influenza infection. An April 2020 review by the Norwood School of Medicine found that evidence is not sufficiently strong to support widespread use of face masks, but supports the use of masks by particularly vulnerable individuals when in transient higher risk situations. All right. Dr. Blaylock, a nationally recognized board-certified neurosurgeon, health practitioner, author, and lecturer, warns that not only do face masks fail to protect the healthy from getting sick, but they also create serious health risks to the wearer. And there's that study. So recent studies have found that about a third of healthcare workers developed headaches with the use of masks. Most had pre-existing headaches that were worsened by the masks wearing, and 60% required pain medications for relief. As to the cause of the headaches, while straps and pressure from the mask could be causative, the bulk of the evidence points towards hypoxia or hypercapnia as the cause. That is a reduction in blood oxygenation, easy for me to say, or an elevation in blood CO2. It is known that the N95 mask, if worn for hours, so even if you do get your hands on one, please don't wear it at work or at the grocery store for hours, can reduce blood oxygenation as much as 20%, which can lead to a loss of consciousness. The importance of these findings is that a drop in oxygen levels is associated with an impairment in immunity. Studies have shown that hypoxia can inhibit the type of main immune cells used to fight viral infection, which has a fancy word, but we usually call them T cells. All right, you may have heard of that. This occurs because the hypoxia increases the level of a compound called hypoxia, which inhibits T cells and stimulates a powerful immune inhibitor cell called the Tregs. This sets the stage for contracting any infection, including COVID-19, and making the consequences of that infection much graver. In essence, your mask may very well put you at an increased risk of infections, and if so, having a much worse outcome. Bet you haven't heard that one before. So here's another review of science relevant to COVID-19 social policy from Ontario from April 2020. There have been extensive randomized controlled trial studies and meta-analysis reviews of RCTs, which all show that masks and respirators do not work to prevent respiratory influenza-like illness, or ILI, you'll probably see that somewhere before, or a respiratory illness believed to be transmission by droplets and aerosol particles, which COVID-19 and the flu, and that's why we keep hearing that, are transmitted by both droplets and aerosols, not just droplets. That's kind of a misnomer. Furthermore, the relevant known physics and biology, which that would be Mr. Rancourt at the top there, are such that masks and respirators should not work. It would be a paradox if masks and respirators worked, given what we know about viral respiratory diseases. The main transmission path is long residence time aerosol particles. The main transmission is aerosols, not droplets, which are too fine to be blocked. And we'll talk about that. Well, Dr. Meehan will get to it when he talks about the Duke study, which is a huge study. The main transmission path is long residence aerosol particles, which are too fine to be blocked, and the minimum infective, I'm guessing it means effective instead of infective, maybe it is infective, dose is smaller than one aerosol particle. Scary, huh? I don't know, maybe not. Here's another study, use of surgical masks to reduce the incidence of the common cold, which the common cold is about 25% of common colds are also coronaviruses, so not everybody knows that either. Among healthcare workers in Japan, a randomized controlled trial. So N95 masked healthcare workers were significantly more likely to experience headaches. Face masks use amongst the healthcare workers were not demonstrated to provide benefit in terms of cold symptoms or getting colds. So that's the best mask, right? The N95 by far that you can't have. Still don't work. Here's another one. Face masks to prevent transmissions of ILI, influenza-like virus. A systematic review. So none of these studies reviewed showed a benefit from wearing a mask. I mean, community members or households. And another one, use of masks and respirators to prevent transmission of influenza. Systematic review. Remember, these are the top of the pyramid, right? There are 17 eligible studies. None of the studies established a conclusive relationship between mask respirator use and protection against ILI. That's probably another study. Self-reported assessment of clinical outcomes was prone to bias. Evidence of a protective effect of masks or respirators against verified respiratory infection was not statistically significant. In fact, many physicians and researchers now believe that because of the ineffectiveness of face masks in stemming the spread of COVID-19 is so widely known and acknowledged in the scientific and medical communities, the goal of widespread mask mandates is based entirely on low-level observational studies, speculative mechanistic studies, fear, and politics, not science. Bottom of the pyramid stuff. All right. So here's another one, universal masking in hospitals from the New England Journal of Medicine. This one is pretty famous, at least to me, sorry. Maybe not to anybody else. So we know that wearing a mask outside healthcare facilities offers little, if any, protection from infection. It is also clear that masks serve symbolic roles. Masks are not only tools, they are also talismans, like a big thing you wear around your neck, right? To keep the bad spirits away or whatever. That may help increase healthcare workers' perceived sense of safety, well-being, and trust in their hospitals. Although such reactions may not be strictly logical, we are all subject to fear and anxiety, especially during times of crisis. One might argue that fear and anxiety are better countered with data and education than a marginally beneficial mask. All right, here is another study from CIDRAP, the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, which is a big deal in the world of COVID-19 and masks and all this good fun stuff. So So they kind of took a meta-analysis again, right? And they're saying that It is not based on sound data. Dr. Brousseau is a national expert on respiratory protection and infectious disease and a retired professor from the University of Illinois, Chicago. So basically another doctor, these doctors did this together, and they're all experts on all this good fun stuff, right? So they made the following key points in their commentary. We do not recommend requiring the general public who do not have symptoms of COVID-19-like illness to routinely wear cloth or surgical masks because there is no scientific evidence they are effective. There's no evidence that they are effective in reducing the risk of COVID-19 transmission. Their use may result in those wearing masks to relax other distancing efforts because they have a sense of protection. So it seems like distancing is more important than masks, at the very least, right? We need to preserve the supply of surgical masks for at-risk healthcare workers. There you go. All right. So here's another study that says there is no policy-grade evidence to support forced masking in the general population. At all the latest decades, policy-grade evidence points to the opposite, not recommending forced masking of the general population. No randomized controlled trial study with verified outcomes shows a benefit for healthcare workers or community members and households to wearing a mask or respirator. There is no such study. There are no exceptions. Likewise, no study exists that shows a benefit from a broad policy to wear masks in public. We're going to do a little more on that later. Therefore, if there were any benefit to wearing a mask because of the blocking power against droplets and aerosol particles, then there should be more benefit from wearing a N95 compared to a surgical mask. Yet several large meta-analyses and all the random controlled trials prove there is no such relative benefit. So once again, the N95s, even those don't work. More studies, more information. Sweeping mask recommendations, as many have proposed, will not reduce SARS-CoV-2 transmission, as evidenced by the widespread practice of wearing such masks in the province in China, where the city of Wuhan is, which we all have heard of that, right? Before and during its mass COVID-19 transmission experience earlier this year. Our review of relevant studies indicates that cloth masks will be ineffective at preventing SARS-CoV-2 transmission, whether worn as source control or as PPE. All right, so now we're on to cloth masks are ineffective and may increase the risk of transmission. Cloth masks, which is basically what I see everybody wearing, right, are absolutely ineffective. Worse yet, they may increase the incidence of disease in wearers and the population. Despite the high-level scientific evidence against cloth masks, the CDC made the inexcusable mistake of telling us cloth masks work. They even provided directions on their website for making homemade cloth masks. A July 2020 review by the University of Oxford Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, which I think they're the #1 rated med school in the country, or the world, found that there is no evidence that cloth masks are at all effective against virus infection or transmission. July 2020 study by Japanese researchers found that cloth masks offer zero protection against coronavirus. This experiment confirmed that wearing cloth and gauze masks can't prevent virus infection. Here's the Duke study that I alluded to earlier. Duke scientists reveal that cloth masks increase aerosolization, easy for me to say another one, of viral particles. So here we go. Duke scientists tested a variety of masks that found that cloth masks seem to disperse the largest droplets into a multitude of smaller droplets, which explains the apparent increase in droplet count relative to no mask in that case, considering that smaller particles are airborne longer than large droplets. Larger droplets sink faster, and the use of such masks might be counterproductive. Neck fleeces, also called gator masks, and often used by runners, were the least infective. In fact, and here we go, wearing a fleece mask resulted in a higher number of respiratory droplets because the material seemed to break down large respiratory droplets into small droplet nuclei that aerosolize, remain suspended in the air for hours, and are capable of traveling large distances with movements of the air. Folded bandanas and knitted masks also performed poorly and did not offer much protection. We were extremely surprised to find that the number of particles measured with the fleece actually exceeded the number of particles measured without wearing any mask. So I see lots of people with the neck gaiters, right? Basically, if I pull my shirt above, I'm wearing a neck gaiter, right? So the neck gaiters, I don't know if you caught that or not, are worse than nothing when it comes to the intake of aerosolized particles. Because me speaking now, droplets are coming out of my mouth. Those droplets tend to not go farther than 6 feet. That's where that recommendation for 6 feet comes from. They come out and they drop, right? Because they're heavy. But if I put a neck gaiter or a fleece or anything described in here over my face, it takes all those droplets and particles and they still come through, but they come through smaller, of course. And so because they're lighter and smaller, they don't drop. They stay in the air. And it says here for hours. All right. So those people who are wearing those things are worse than people wearing nothing. And why places haven't been very strict as to letting people wear those types of things, either haven't read the Duke study, don't care, don't follow science. I don't know. That's me editorializing. I apologize, but here we go. The Duke findings add to what we have known since 2015. Cloth masks don't work. In 2015, the first randomized controlled trial of cloth mask usage among little over 1,600 hospital healthcare workers demonstrated that cloth masks not only don't work, but they were also associated with large amounts of adverse events and resulted in significantly higher rates of infection than medical masks, and also performed worse than the control arm. So obviously the control, they had a control in that study, right? A control group. Adverse events associated with face masks were reported in 40% of healthcare workers in the medical mask arm and 42% in the cloth mask arm. General discomfort, 35%, and breathing problems, 18%, were the most frequently reported adverse events. Laboratory tests showed that penetration of particles through the cloth masks to be very high, 97%, compared with medical masks, 44% used in the trial, and an N95 made by 3M, which basically was nil. None, negligible. So the conclusions to this 2015 study is that which was the first randomly controlled trial of cloth masks, and the results caution against the use of cloth masks. This is an important finding to inform occupational health and safety. Moisture retention, use of cloth masks, and poor filtration may result in increased risk of infection. Further research is needed to inform the widespread use of cloth masks globally. However, as a precautionary measure, cloth masks should be recommended for healthcare workers, particularly in high-risk situations, and guidelines needed to be updated. This is an important finding to inform occupational health and safety. Moisture retention, use of cloth masks, and poor filtration may result in increased risk of infection. All right, going their own way. So Dr. Meehan wants to put a fine point on all the science that the CDC and all knew or should have known before they recommended the population do something that was likely to increase viral infection and transmission. The only thing cloth masks are good for is making people sick. How could Fauci, Birx, so Dr. Birx was another, probably the number two right behind Fauci. I'm assuming everybody knows Fauci, right? You can look these people up if you really want. Redfield, who was the head of the CDC itself, and the World Health Organization, be so egregiously inept and blatantly ignorant of the established science that they would dangerously recommend universal masking? That's a question that we'd all love to have an answer to, but I don't think we have one. All right. So masks as a mean of source control. No, my mask does not protect you from me. The public is being repeatedly misinformed by catchy guilt and fear-based marketing messages designed to promote the social responsibility or guilt to wear masks as a form of source control. I wear my mask for you, and you wear your mask for me. Where is the evidence for these claims? On the websites where these unscientific marketing messages are found, there are never references to science that support the claims. In fact, despite almost everything that has been drilled into the public psyche regarding masks, has little to no basis, easy for me to read, in science, and absolutely no robust support from the highest level evidence-based research. Masks have never been proven to protect either the wearer or the community from the transmission of respiratory pathogens. Mask mandates during a pandemic are opposed to decades of high-level science. Simply put, the public is being misled by fraudulent claims supported with weak pseudoscience. The fallacious argument, well, if masks don't work, then why do surgeons wear them? All right, so here's where Dr. Meehan comes in. He is an ophthalmologist. He's an eye doctor, right? He specializes in ocular immunology, inflammation, and infectious disease. He's performed over 10,000 surgical procedures wearing a surgical mask. He has suffered the detrimental effects that masks cause to his mental health and physical function during long surgeries. Because most of the surgeries he performed were microscopic procedures that required fine motor skills, he changed his mask frequently to prevent the detrimental effects of deoxygenization. Easy for me to say. However, these facts alone don't qualify him as an expert on the matter. What qualifies him is his experience as an editor of a medical journal. The fact that he's peer-reviewed thousands of preprint research articles, that he is an expert at reading medical research, distinguishing good science from bad, and separating fact from fiction. He says the medical literature is filled with bad fiction masquerading as medical science. It is very easy to be deceived by bad science. Since the beginning of the pandemic, he's read hundreds of studies on the science of medical masks based on extensive review and analysis. There is no question in his mind that healthy people should not be wearing surgical or cloth masks, nor should they be recommending universal masking of all members of the population. That recommendation is not supported by the highest level of scientific evidence. First, the premise that surgeons wearing masks serves as evidence that masks must be worn to prevent viral transmission is a logical fallacy. He would classify this claim as an argument of false equivalence or comparing apples to oranges. Surgical masks offer no benefit in protecting patients from the surgeon's respiratory droplets contaminating the surgical field and the exposed tissues of surgical patients. Surgeons well versed in the scientific research regarding medical masks, especially I'm having a great day today. Systemic reviews published by the Cochrane Collaboration Wound Group know that surgical face masks provide no benefit in the prevention of surgical wound infections. Surgeons with experience wearing surgical masks during long surgeries have undoubtedly experienced and understand the detrimental effects masks have on respiration, blood oxygenation, mental and physical performance. For these science-based reasons, there is a worldwide trend towards surgeons and operating room staff no longer wearing surgical masks during clean surgery cases. Nevertheless, many surgeons continue to wear face masks during clean surgery cases and outpatient minor procedures. They do so more for symbolic purposes, habit, tradition, or non-infrequently because of institutional ignorance. That is, they are forced to wear masks because it is the ignorant, anti-science policy of the hospital or surgery center where they perform their surgeries. Although wearing a mask during a clean surgery isn't necessary, there are also surgical cases where surgical masks, eye protection, and face shields are still a good idea. For example, cases in which bone saws, drills, and other surgical power tools can expose the surgical team to splashes and splatters from the patient's bodily fluids. If a surgeon were sick, especially with a viral infection, they would not perform surgery as they know the virus would not be stopped by their surgical mask. Another area of false equivalence has to do with the environment in which the masks are worn. The environments in which surgeons wear masks minimize the adverse effects surgical masks have on their wearers. Unlike the public wearing masks, in the community, surgeons work in sterile surgical suites equipped with heavy-duty air exchange systems that maintain positive pressures, exchange and filter the room air at a very high level, and increase the oxygen content of the room air. These conditions limit the negative effects of masks on the surgeon and operating room staff. And yet, despite these extreme climate control conditions, clinical studies demonstrate the negative effects of surgical masks on surgeon physiology and performance. Surgeons and operating room personnel are well-trained, experienced, and meticulous about maintaining sterility. They only wear fresh, sterile masks. They don the mask in a sterile fashion. They wear the mask for short periods of time and change it out at the first signs of the excessive moisture buildup that we know degrades mask effectiveness and increases their negative effects. Surgeons never reuse surgical masks, nor do they ever wear cloth masks. The public is being told to wear masks for which they do not have not been trained in proper techniques. I've heard from folks that I know who are doctors or have spouses who are doctors that they take an entire class in medical school about the proper techniques of just literally putting on a mask and things like that, which obviously they haven't offered us. As a result, they are mishandling, frequently touching, and constantly reusing masks in a way that increases contamination and are more likely than not to increase transmission of disease. Just go watch people at the grocery store or Walmart and tell them what you think about effectiveness of masks in the community. If you can't help but believe and trust the weak retrospective observational studies and confuse public health authorities lying to you about the benefits of completely ignoring the risks of medical masks, then you should at least reject the illogical anti-science recommendation to block only 2 of the 3 ports of entry for viral diseases. Masks only cover the mouth and nose. They do not protect the eyes. Bringing that up again. While it may go against conventional wisdom, they may seem counterintuitive to those who are not involved in scientific research. The actual scientific evidence does not support the proposition that wearing a mask is an effective method of source control to prevent the spread of infection. Many surgeons are surprised to learn that when surgical masks are put to the test in randomized controlled trials, they fail to demonstrate benefit. In fact, surgical masks have repeatedly failed to provide evidence of effectiveness as a means of source control, even in the one environment where they so steadfastly adhere to, the operating room. Simply put, based on the actual science, face masks have repeatedly been found to be ineffective as a means of source control. Face masks do not protect against the very risk for which the defendants are forcing small children to wear face masks all day. Source control. I have a lot of studies that talk about this also that Dr. Meehan hasn't mentioned yet, and hopefully I'll do another one of these, and we'll see that in those future presentations. All right, in 2014, Cochrane Collaboration Wounds Group reviewed all research related to the topic of effectiveness of face masks for preventing surgical wound infections, and here's what they found. The 3 randomized controlled trials were included, involving a total of over 2,000 surgical team participants. There was no statistically significant difference in infection rates between the masked and unmasked group in any of the trials. And that is playing out in real life data too. And we'll talk about that in a future one too, hopefully. In 2016, all right, same thing. They, in another study, or the same study, overall, we found very few studies and identified no new trials for this latest update. We analyzed a total of over 2,000 participants from these 3 studies we found. All 3 randomized controlled trials showed that wearing a face mask during surgery neither increases nor decreases the number of wound infections occurring after surgery. We conclude that there is no clear evidence that wearing disposable mask affects the likelihood of wound infections developing after surgery. Now here's another study. The 6-month-long study showed significant decrease in the rate of patient infections when masks were not worn in an operating theater. Another study, the wearing of surgical face masks have no effect upon the overall operating room environmental contamination. Paper that analyzed numerous studies says, however, overall there is a lack of substantial evidence to support claims that face masks protect either patient or surgeon from infectious contamination. So Dr. Meehan is the one who's putting the capitalizations and bolds in here, right? Another study there at the bottom. In fact, there was a significant decrease in infection rate with no masks. Continuing, we're just finding more and more, just basically saying the same thing, right? So the evidence for discontinuing the use of surgical face masks would appear to be stronger than the evidence available to support their continued use. There is little evidence to suggest that the wearing of surgical face masks by staff in the operating theater decreased post-operative wound infections. However, there is evidence indicating a significant reduction in post-operative wound infection rates when theater staff are unmasked. All right. Currently, there is no evidence that removing masks presents an additional hazard to patients. What else? Our decision to no longer require routine surgical masks for personnel not scrubbed for surgery is a departure from common practice, but the evidence to support this practice does not exist. So Dr. Meehan's only presented a partial list of various meta-analyses and systemic reviews of multiple randomized controlled trials. The studies represent the highest level of evidence that masks don't work. This WHO Commission study is the best counter to my arguments. To any trained researcher, this study falls far short of countering decades of science previously presented. Advocates for mask mandates simply don't have the highest levels of scientific evidence to support their arguments. They can only cite low-level science research. We've already stated things like this, right? So he's going to talk about a WHO study that cleverly disguised an example of low-level garbage dressed up to appear better than it is. You have to examine the details to detect the weak deception. So here is evidence for masks as promised. The best evidence for masks was commissioned by the WHO and published in The Lancet in June 2020. The title, Physical Distancing Face Masks and Eye Protection to Prevent Person-to-Person Transmission of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. Sounds like high-level scientific evidence. After all, systemic reviews and meta-analyses are typically considered the epitome of evidence-based medicine. However, don't be deceived by the doctor's deceptive attempts to elevate the relevancy of this study. This systemic review / meta-analysis was entirely comprised of low-level observational studies. No high-level randomized control trials were included. No matter how much the authors attempt to deceive or embellish the study's relevance with its dressed-up title, the facts remain. This study still amounts to nothing more than a steaming pile of weak evidence. No matter how much the authors in the WHO want to study this study to represent high-level evidence for masking world populations, it simply cannot be considered to be more than the sum of its low-level parts. Furthermore, the study is seriously flawed with serious misrepresentations and misinterpretations of the data. The flaws, errors, and mistakes in this analysis of 29 observational studies should lead to its retraction from The Lancet. The flaws are buried in the data tables, therefore it is missed by those that do little more than read titles and conclusions. I would be one of those people. Which is exactly why studies like this should be subjected to thorough and independent peer review before publication. Scientists all over the world are raising concerns and speaking against the study and demanding its retraction. For example, University of Toronto epidemiology professor, that guy, called the WHO study methodological, essentially useless. And there's the link to that. Garbage in, garbage out. The June 2020 WHO Commission study of mass published in The Lancet. So another example from basically this is a group of people who's saying that it's flawed and should be retracted. A Swiss group doing the same thing. All right, so here we go. Update. A U.S. analyst has reviewed all 29 studies and found numerous additional mistakes. So I'm guessing people who think that masks work are using this WHO study as like the greatest thing since sliced bread. But Dr. Meehan obviously has just gone on and on and on about how this study is flawed in so many different ways, in so many different shapes, and so many different forms. So here are some limitations of the studies typically used to support masks. So same things. They're low-level evidence. They can't distinguish correlation from causation. Doesn't measure face cover use in the community or measure of compliance. It's hard to control. Doesn't measure types of masks worn. Doesn't assess adverse effects of masks. They don't control for the community-wide or hospital-specific interventions that may have contributed to co-founded their observations, including a bunch of different things listed there. So masks are unnecessary. Fear and politics are subverting science and reason. Public health officials and the media have been warning us that coronavirus kills not just old or immunocompromised people, but young people too. While this is true, it remains extremely rare. So a pandemic of fraud and fear is more dangerous than COVID-19 pandemic. Death rate data from the CDC. Parameter values that vary among 5 COVID pandemic planning scenarios. So there you go. Basically, no matter what age you are, you're going to survive. At least to the 97th percentile at the lowest. All right. So here's a lot of information on that chart. So masking children in schools is unnecessary, so says the science. School and daycare transmission studies show that transmission of COVID-19 among unmasked children is remarkably low. German study finds that low COVID-19 infection rates in schools. Tests of pupils and teachers in Saxony suggest children may act as brake on infection. So a lot of schools in Europe have been going to school for the last year and pretty much throughout this year, and so they have a lot of data. So the study by the University in Dresden, Germany, they analyzed blood samples. So they're saying that Germany suggests that schools may not play a big role in spreading the virus, as some feared. So 0.6% of school children demonstrated antibodies. So basically, when they tested them, that's how the test came up. All cases were symptomatic. There were no fatalities. Children may even act as a brake on infection. Infections in schools had not led to an outbreak, while the spread of the virus within households was also less dynamic than previously thought. For other states with low infection rates, the study suggests schools could be reopened without fear of causing widespread outbreaks of the virus. Sweden and Finland, 0.05 of children infected with COVID-19. So Sweden kept schools open and unmasked during the pandemic, yet their decision to adhere to the science and do what has always been done before did not lead to a higher rate of infection among children compared to the neighboring Finland, where schools were temporarily closed. All right. So, once again, it doesn't make a difference either way. Swedish children fared better than children in other countries during the pandemic, both in terms of education and mental health. COVID-19 transmission rate of 0.03 among children in schools and nurseries in Australia. So there's a study basically saying the same conclusions as in Europe. Out of almost 1,500 contacts in total, the rate of secondary transmission was found to be 1.2%. So that's a student giving giving the disease to an adult or someone outside of their household or school, right? Or within their household. All right, so look at these super low rates. So child to child was 0.3, child to staff was 1.0, staff to child was 1.5, staff to staff was 4.4. Children are less likely to transmit the virus than adults. All right. So here we go. 17 ways that masks can cause harm. Wearing masks for extended periods increased incidences of headaches and negatively affected work performance. We've talked about that already. Masks inhibit airflow out of the lungs. True. Medical masks lower blood oxygen, raise carbon dioxide levels. We've talked about that. Just lots of information behind that. 2, medical masks lower oxygen levels in the blood. Just tons of different information on this. Your heart muscle needs oxygen to survive. Oxygen to the heart muscle is severely reduced, according to this study. All right. Three, medical masks raise carbon dioxide levels in the blood. Face masks use carbon dioxide rebreathing and hypocapnia. Masks trap CO2-rich respiratory exhalations in the mask-mouth interface, forcing rebreathing of CO2-rich exhalations, raise carbon blood, raise CO2 levels, right? All right. So here's some symptoms of carbon dioxide toxicity, just in case you ever get any of those from wearing a mask. More information on... So here's a video that demonstrates the use of TCUD, which is transcranial ultrasound Doppler, and heart rate variability to measure the adverse effects of masking a healthy 9-year-old child. SARS-CoV-2 is armed with a furin cleavage site that makes it more pathogenic. So at the molecular level, there's some cleavage in the molecule that basically makes the virus even more capable of invading cells when oxygen levels decline, which basically makes the masks make it more likely for you to catch it and make it worse for you. Number 5, medical masks trap exhaled viral and other pathogens in the mouth mask interspace, increase viral infectious load, and increase the severity of disease. We've talked about this. SARS-CoV-2 becomes more dangerous when blood oxygen levels decline. The furin cleavage site of SARS-CoV-2 increases cellular invasion, especially during hypoxia. Cloth masks may increase the risk of contracting COVID-19 and other respiratory infections. We've talked about that. Wearing a face mask may give a false sense of security. We've talked about that. Masks compromise communications and reduce social distancing. True and true. We've talked about that, at least according to the data and the evidence. Untrained and improper management of face masks just makes things worse. Masks worn imperfectly are dangerous. Very true. I think the conclusion there is why even bother, right? Masks collect and colonize viruses, bacteria, and mold. On and on and on. If you ever feel like stopping on any of these, please feel free, of course. Lots of evidence to that. Wearing a face mask makes the exhaled air go into the eyes, which is true. So you're just taking what, if you're breathing. Contact tracing studies show that asymptomatic carrier transmission is very rare, and there's lots of studies to back that up, and I'll hope to give you more of these in the future to talk about that more. Face masks and stay-at-home orders prevent the development of herd immunity 100%. That's based on basically 100 years of and more of viral scientific-based evidence. Number 17, face masks are dangerous and contradicted. That's a word right there. For a large number of people with pre-existing medical conditions and disabilities. And that's all of them. Masking school children is ineffective, unnecessary, and harmful. Face masks are not only ineffective, they are more dangerous than parents are being told. Scientific study after scientific study over the course of many years have concluded that wearing face masks for extended periods of time puts the wearer, especially children, at imminent risk of psychological and physical harms. If the previous section, masks are harmful, did not serve to make you question much of what you have heard about the risks of medical masks, let us now examine what the science and experts say about masking children. So the reason this is in blue is because that whole thing is a link. All right. Mandatory masks in school are a major threat to children's development, doctors warn. The Great Barrington Declaration. A letter authored by 3 top epidemiologists and professors on October 4th, 2020, as of 6:00 p.m. October 9th, 2020, has been signed by over 4,000 medical and public health scientists and 7,000 medical practitioners. This is a portion of their consensus declaration. As infectious disease epidemiologists and public health scientists, we have grave concerns about the damaging physical and mental health impacts on the prevailing COVID-19 policies and recommend an approach we call focused protection. Thus, the most compassionate approach that balances the risks and benefits of each reaching herd immunity is to allow those who are at minimal risk of death to live their lives normally, to build up immunity to the virus through natural infection while better protecting those who are at risk. We call this focused protection. How many here have heard of the Great Barrington Declaration? Forcing children to wear face masks is unnecessary. Some evidence of that. Forcing children to wear face masks for long periods of time risks causing them physical injuries. So one of the things that he talks about there is how they can't see down low. They lose their peripheral vision down low, so they'll trip and fall, amongst other things. All right. Forcing children to wear face masks for long periods risks causing them mental and psychological injuries. And there's data to back that up. Hopefully I'll be able to get to that one day for y'all. Lots of studies. More studies. More studies. And that's about it. So, thank you for watching. The news you're never going to find in the news because the news no longer reports the news. They just follow the narrative. All right. So, masks, are they effective? Are they necessary? Are they harmful? What do you think? Do you still have questions? Do you have a counter evidence? Please let me know. Thank you for helping us upset the social order. Thank you for helping us push back against the narrative. Hopefully we're able to fulfill our one promise, providing you the truth. Once again, do not trust me. Do not trust anyone. Do your own research because you never know. I might just be doing nothing but spitting in the wind.